Breaking now, a woman is dead. A man, possibly a naval criminal investigator, shot and critically hurt.
Now, the NCIS agents were here conducting an internal investigation into the now deceased NCIS recruiter. He was apparently the target of domestic abuse allegations.
Very sad situation. Neighbors say that woman expressed fear for her life in the past.
When a Texas woman made domestic abuse allegations against her husband, who worked for the military, an investigation was conducted. The authorities wanted to find out how something like this could happen, but it's how the husband reacted to the allegations that is the most shocking, senseless, and saddening thing of all. Takara Glenn was a 34-year-old woman who lived in Texas. She was glamorous, intelligent, and a strong-willed woman who was fiercely loyal to those who she loved and cared for. Many people said that one of her most amazing features was how she cared so much for her children. Takara was a devoted mother who wanted to provide everything that she could for her babies so that they could grow up in a better and happier world. But not only was Takara an amazing mother, but she was also a supportive and loving wife to her husband, Greg Hightower. The two of them had been married for 15 years, and their relationship truly had stood the test of time. Greg, who was originally from Illinois, worked as a Navy senior chief recruiter, a career that he had built up over a 19-year period. To the outside world, Takara and Greg had an idyllic relationship, one that many people may have been jealous of. But of course, you can't always judge a book by its cover, and you never know what goes on behind closed doors. Domestic abuse is a terrible form of abuse that affects millions of marriages around the world. It happens when one or both partners become physically, verbally, or mentally abusive towards the other person. And sadly, this is exactly the kind of things that was going off between Takara and Greg. So one day in August of 2019, Takara decided that she was going to report her husband to the authorities for hitting her. The police initially took the report seriously and started looking into Greg and the family dynamic. But when Greg filed a counter-report, saying that it was in fact Takara that was hitting him, the police seemed to back off a little. It's like they started to think that this was a petty squabble that had gotten out of hand, and now they were reporting each other for no good reason. And for that reason, they dismissed the case and filed no charges against either of them. Of course, what the police couldn't have known was this lack of action from them only made things worse and escalated the tensions between Takara and Greg. Over the next few years, the arguments and fights between them got worse. It wasn't until September of 2022, over 3 whole years after her initial report to the police, that Takara contacted them for help again.
Any idea how long she had been reporting the domestic situations to law enforcement before this point?
I don't know in terms of a time period. I was told that there were several incidents that had already been occurring. That's the information that we have. And they were following up just to learn more about the allegations that were occurring.
This time, the police took the complaint a little more seriously. They knew that there couldn't be smoke without fire, so they arranged to interview Takara at her home about the incident. If she was truly suffering from domestic violence, then she would be able to tell them all about it from the comfort of her own home, as well as show them any evidence and proof that this was in fact going on. This was not an easy thing for Takara to do, though. Her personality was telling her that she shouldn't destroy her family, and she shouldn't betray her husband Greg in this way, but the sensible part of her was telling her that it needed reporting if she wanted the domestic abuse to end. Takara knew that if she wanted to make sure her children were safe and didn't see or experience any hurt or violence, then she was doing the right thing by going to the police. Word soon got out to neighbors, who struggled to understand why Greg would be a nasty and violent man behind closed doors.
It's crazy. Never would have expected it. Nice family.
It's a big surprise for me. Nah, he wouldn't do that with put all his career on jeopardy and stuff like that. That don't make no sense. This incident does not seem like him at all. Nah, they threw me for a loop when they said what he done.
But when Greg found out what was happening, he was infuriated and reacted in the most violent and devastating way imaginable. On the afternoon of September the 22nd, 2022, Takara was being interviewed by an NCIS officer. They were specially trained in dealing with victims of domestic abuse and knew how to tackle the subject delicately and discreetly. They questioned Takara on what had been going off in her home and for how long the violence had been happening, and she answered honestly and openly. It was a relief for her to be able to finally get it all out in the open and get the help that she had been seeking.
The neighbors say that woman expressed fear for her life. In the past, family members who were here on the scene told us that couple had been married for about 15 years, had multiple children, but recently struggled with domestic violence.
The NCIS agent needed to step out of the home for a moment to make a few phone calls and figure out his next steps in how to help Takara out, when all of a sudden the door to the home burst open and Greg marched in, furious that his wife had been taking such drastic steps against him. Terrified, Takara tried to tell him to calm down, but Greg was not there to talk, nor was he there to be calm. He simply raised a handgun that he had concealed, and he fired at Takara. The bullets killed her instantly, but the most shocking thing of all was that at the time of the shooting, she was holding their baby in her arms.
We can tell you one of those children, according to the sheriff, was actually being held by his mother when her husband shot and killed her.
If just one of the bullets had missed Takara, there is no question that the baby would have been killed. Takara's lifeless body dropped to the floor, with the screaming baby still clutched in her arms, as if she were still protecting him, even after the horrific act that had rendered her dead. Greg stashed the gun back away, turned, and left the property before the NCIS agent returned and before authorities had a chance to turn up.
Breaking now, a woman is dead. A man, possibly a naval criminal investigator, shot and critically hurt.
Tonight we are seeing and hearing how chaotic that scene was from a neighbor's security camera video.
Outside the house, Greg opened fire on the unsuspecting NCIS agents, who quickly returned fire. This violent exchange was caught on the security cameras of a house on the opposite side of the street.
Details on a deadly shooting that left the parents of 6 children dead and an NCIS agent wounded.
One of the agents was shot, but luckily, the bullet didn't strike anything vital. When he was taken to hospital shortly after, he was in a stable condition and predicted to make a full recovery. The uninjured officer ran towards a neighboring house as Greg drove off and tried to find assistance. What the officer didn't know was that Greg had also been struck with one of the bullets, and while he wasn't fatally injured, he was losing blood and would need medical attention soon. Luckily, while in search of aid, a good Samaritan let the NCIS officer in, and he would call for help and get the situation a little more under control. It wasn't too long before backup was on the scene, and the true horror of what had happened was revealed.
Female inside the house, when our units arrived, found her deceased, still grabbing or holding on to her infant child. They were able to rescue the child and get him out to safety.
It was nothing short of a miracle that the baby had survived. However, the death of the Takara was harrowing, and the injury of the NCIS agent was terrible. They knew that they had to track Greg down for the safety of the community. So a statewide police search began trying to identify where he was and how dangerous he was to the public. But where was Greg, and why had he reacted so violently to the reports of domestic violence? Police feared that Greg would have fled and tried to get as far away from the scene as possible. Most criminals try to put as much distance between themselves and the scene of their crime as they can, so as to cast doubt on whether they really were there to commit the crime. But strangely, but also thankfully, Greg had not gone very far at all. In fact, another patrol unit found him sitting in his car outside of his mother's house, around 25 miles away from where he had killed Takara. In fact, it was his mother who had called the police in the first place, concerned for her son and his safety. In moments, Greg's car was surrounded by many different police patrol cars. There was nowhere for him to run, and no way he could escape justice. But what happened next, and how the story continued to unfold, was shocking. The police started by asking Greg to give himself up. Perhaps he would come quietly and explain why he had shot Takara. The authorities thought that maybe it had been a pure moment of anger and madness that had drove him to shoot his wife in such close proximity to their child, and then shoot at NCIS officers. Greg didn't respond though, despite the police pleading with him and asking him to come quietly. He just remained still and quiet in his parked-up car. Officers even tried telling him that he needed medical attention. He had, after all, received a pretty bad injury during the initial shootout, and if left untreated, the injury would only get worse. Yet still, Greg didn't respond and didn't show any signs of giving up or even hearing them. He just didn't acknowledge them at all. But just as officers were starting to run out of ideas, things suddenly escalated quickly and got completely out of control.
Policeman, before I knew it, in an instant, jumped out the car and I heard him holler like 3 or 4 times, put it away, put it away, put it down, and boom, boom, boom. It was...
In an instant, Greg had jumped out of his car and opened fire on the surrounding police officers. He already had blood over his body, and he seemed in some kind of crazed daze. Perhaps he thought he could fight his way out of the situation, or perhaps he knew that this was the end for him, and he wanted to go out in a blaze of violence and glory. Whatever the case was, the authorities had no other option but to respond by firing their own guns on him, which killed him instantly there in the street. No one had expected it to go from 0 to 100 in such a short space of time.
The husband later shot and killed by deputies after allegedly opening fire on them at a different scene.
A neighbor we spoke with says the wife told him multiple times in the past she was scared for her safety.
It's a crazy day, you know. We talked about it last night and she told me that she was in fear for her life last night, and I actually helped her lock up the house and get everything together, and then this happened.
The whole incident was over, but there was still so much to do and so many questions left unanswered. Why had Greg reacted so violently? Where had he gotten the gun from? And could the police have done anything to prevent this from happening in the first place? Many of the answers died with Takara and Greg, but that didn't stop the authorities from searching for the truth. There would of course be a massive investigation into how all of this happened after the fact. Facts will be picked apart, and every decision from every authority would be called into question to figure out how this case of clear domestic violence had not only gotten so out of hand, but being ignored in the first place. The police could have stopped this in 2019 when they received their first domestic abuse report from Takara, but they did nothing and dropped the case. It is this sort of thing that the family will be fighting for. They understandably wanted justice for Takara and to find some closure after her tragic and completely avoidable death. But there were other direct victims in this horrifying case, Takara and Greg's children. They were now left alone in this world, and it was down to Takara's family to help raise them as best as they could. In a long and heartfelt Facebook post, Takara's sister said, "My heart is torn into pieces about my baby sister, my bestest friend. My first baby before I ever even thought about having a baby is gone." The post went on to talk about how Takara's children would have to grow up without not only their mother, but also their father. But the family pulled together and vowed to not only raise the children properly, but also not let them forget their mother. They would never let Takara's memory die, and her love would live on through her children. Domestic violence cases are all too common in the US and around the world, and it's a cycle that seems to have no end. But if you are suffering from domestic abuse, reach out and contact establishments and people who can help before it's too late, because you don't want to become another statistic in the history of domestic abuse. So now it's over to you. What did you think of this horrifying story? Why do you think Greg reacted so violently to Takara speaking to the NCIS officer? And could police have done anything more to prevent this tragedy from happening? We love to hear from you, so be sure to leave your thoughts and opinions in the comments section down below. Please give this video a like and a subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.